to be with you all today, although I have to admit it's a little intimidating to follow that lovely and resonant voice of that introduction. So again, I appreciate your taking the time on a lovely August afternoon when probably many of us have other things to do. But hopefully I'm going to be able to help you think a little bit about how to improve the effectiveness of your preservation arguments today. The topic we're going to be talking about is fairly complex, so I'm actually going to keep it relatively simple. I'm going to sort of focus in on one aspect of how you might demonstrate the economic benefits of preservation decisions. As a result of this, so we'll talk about it from one particular angle, but presumably as a result of that, you'll also have a more expanded toolbox to be able to go ahead and look at it from other angles as well. So I apologize for if I have to clear my throat once in a while. It's a little rusty today. And let's see if we can make this thing go. Hello. All right, so I'm trying to get the presentation to start. There we go. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our plan for today. We're going to start by sort of talking a little bit about the source of the problem and talking about the source of some potential solutions. And by that I mean it's going to require thinking a little bit about economic language and economic arguments and the difference in perception between a property owner and a person who cares about preservation in the community. We'll talk about a couple of key economic ideas, and I said do the math, but if you're going to do the math, you really have to have the framework, of course, to be able to understand the math. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can actually quantify these things. So let's start with the problem. As most of you who've been in preservation situations before are aware, property owners often want to tear down a building for reasons, or want to, shall we say, muddle a building for reasons that to people in the community, particular people who care about preservation, maybe can't fathom. So we look at it and we say, why on earth would you want a parking lot or a vinyl-clad box or that garbled up mess here instead of the buildings that exist? Why don't they understand how beautiful the building is, what it represents, what impact that building has on the neighborhood? The problem is that we have a very different frame of perspective if we're talking about myself as owner of a property versus a person in the community. If I own a property, I have to think in terms of typically a more short-term gain situation than in terms of a long-term investment. That's not always the case. There are people who are very astute about understanding long-term issues, but a lot of times a property owner is thinking in terms of their short-term gains. That's either because they want to or because they have to. Because of their own financial situation, they may not, especially if we're talking about smaller property owners, they might not have the luxury of thinking about their property as a long-term investment, or if they just simply may not be accustomed to regarding their property in that manner. So typically a property owner, and this is for many of you going to be nothing new, property owners will typically make a decision that they feel is in their best interest. We all know the old saw about a bird in the hand. So for a property owner, especially a property owner that's maybe working closer to the economic margins than a massive corporation, taking the bird in the hand, taking the short-term, reasonably safe opportunity may look like the better idea, even if there are potential longer-term ramifications for themselves. And we'll talk about the impacts of the rest of the community in a minute. Oops, I think I hit the button twice. There we go. All right. Given all of that, we all know that a property owner, the decisions that they make can create some pretty broad impacts. And most people, we know that because we know the impacts that a neighbor can have on our property. We know what can happen if the person who lives next door to us or has the business next door to us chooses to paint their building in a garish color, or chooses to not maintain their building, or chooses to put up a very ugly vinyl replacement on their building. We know through our daily lives that the decisions that a property owner makes can impact the larger community. But that goes against an understanding that most people have who aren't thinking about historic preservation and about community issues. People tend, on a broad basis, to think about property as a financial asset. Here's the interesting piece. If you want to demonstrate the economic benefit of a preservation decision, whether it's a decision not to demolish a building, whether it's a decision to restore a building instead of mucking it up in one form or another, chances are you're not going to be able to make that equation work from the property owner's perspective. Because the property owner is going to be working from a more limited mathematical standpoint, a more limited financial standpoint than you're thinking about on behalf of the broader community. If you're strictly thinking about the property as a financial asset, chances are, a financial asset to a particular individual, chances are it's going to be very difficult, unless they've made a fundamental error in their calculations, which most of these people are not going to do that. You're going to need, it's not going to be very feasible to show that they did their math wrong. So in order to do the math to demonstrate the benefits of a preservation decision, it's really going to be necessary to reframe the discussion away from the individual and toward the broader community. And because it's a matter of, in most cases, reframing the decision away from the property owner to the broader community, we end up with a very different audience. As you see on this screen, my argument to you would be that if you want to speak about the economic benefits of preservation, one of the most receptive audiences that I think you're likely to find, and this may go against your local experience, but hang with me for a minute. Elected officials are the ones who are going to be probably most receptive to arguments that a preservation decision is in the long-term interest of the community, that it's a better economic decision overall than the short-term limited focus decision that a particular property owner may be choosing to make. Obviously, an elected official has more power to influence those private property decisions than anybody else. They've got more sticks through zoning and police powers. They've got more opportunity for carrots. Obviously, the types of carrots that are available aren't always the same now as they used to be, but most local governments do have some access to ability to provide some kind of an incentive to help offset the property owner's economic hit, if there is a hit to preserving a property, and they have more accountability to the community. But as you think about making those kind of arguments to your elected officials, to your community decision-making leadership, you have to keep in mind that an elected official today more than ever has to think about real estate from a money perspective. And that's for political reasons. You know, we all hear the arguments about not raising property taxes and not raising any kind of tax, really, and the need to do more with less, and et cetera, et cetera. But they also have to think about that because the financial health of the community is their prime responsibility. So obviously, this is not any surprise to anybody, and probably more so today than it's been in a very long time. Elected officials are under a lot of pressure to manage their tax dollars very tightly. So if you're going to demonstrate that a preservation decision makes good economic sense, the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to be able to demonstrate, particularly to elected officials, that a preservation decision will have an impact on the community's financial health. And that financial health is going to be impacted by the externalities and the opportunity costs of the decisions relating to that property. I'll explain those terms in a minute. The more we can point that out, the more we can demonstrate that element of the math, which is going to be overlooked and which is going to be not calculated by the property owner, the more we can expand the understanding of the economic impact of a property and a preservation decision, the more we're going to be likely to persuade those elected officials who have the primary responsibility and the primary sticks and carrots to deal with the situation, the more likely we're going to be to persuade them that it's a good policy decision to support the historic preservation choice instead of the demolition or mucking up choice. Oh, excuse me. All right, now I have to take a big step back to Economics 101. And if you've had your Economics 101, you can go get a cup of coffee now. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a couple of basic economic issues. The first one is an externality. So what does externality mean? Again, this is a very basic term that your economics classes way back when will have probably used. But as a refresher, it's an effect that's external, that's often unforeseen or unintended, that accompanies a process or activity. It's an impact that isn't experienced by the actor. If I choose to not maintain my house, the impact that not maintaining my house has on the value of my neighbor's property is an externality to me. It's a real impact to them, but it's an effect on them, not on me. From my point of view, it may be a very good idea to not maintain my house because I don't have the money, I don't have the time, I don't have the skills. There's a cost to me to preserving my property, and if I think strictly from my own self-interest, it might not be a bad idea not to do the maintenance work that's necessary to preserve my own property. However, if I choose to do that, there's an externality to the properties around me. So it's a cost, or conceivably it can be a benefit. If I really fix up my house, then maybe that has a positive benefit on other properties. But it's experienced by somebody other than the economic actor. In the cases we're talking about, the owner of the property that we're looking at preserving. So the externality is not part of my decision-making, typically, if I'm the property owner. It's not part of my equation. But it's a big part of the equation if we're looking at it from a community standpoint. An opportunity cost is not quite a flip side to an externality, but it's a similar sort of concept. And as you can see on the definition here, it's an alternative, the cost of a choice that has to be foregone in order to pursue a certain action. So an opportunity cost is what you could have gotten by making a different choice. When I went back to do my master's degree, the opportunity cost to me was the income that I could have earned during the time that I was going back to grad school. If I am choosing to demolish a building, the opportunity cost is what I could have done with the existing building. I hope that makes sense. So the opportunity cost, that can be to the community or it can be to the economic actor, but it's what you gave up to make the choice that you're going to make. Now, typically, opportunity costs get treated, people don't really think about those a whole lot because they're sort of what ifs, they're maybes. So typically, and local governments tend to not look at opportunity costs. People in general, unless you're talking about a very specific situation like, can we live on my husband's salary while I go back to graduate school if the opportunity cost is to give up my salary? That we typically don't do that kind of opportunity cost calculation. But I would argue to you that if you can show the opportunity cost, if you can show the value of what you've given up by making the choices that have been made, and you can make that reasonably concrete, then that can be a very compelling argument. So let's go back to the local government perspective. And I'm going to focus again on the local government perspective because those are the people who have the most ability to influence your property owner's decisions. You could use similar arguments to deal with somebody who is, an advocate, to deal with a potential buyer, etc., but it's going to be a little different perspective. So there's a variety of kinds of externalities and opportunity costs that we can be talking about when we talk about a local government. And I'm going to drill down on the tax issues, particularly because in this day and age, obviously pretty much every community that you deal with is struggling with tax issues. Finding enough revenue to pay for the services that our residents, our customers, our businesses have come to expect. So the opportunity cost of revenues includes things like the property taxes that a property could pay, income taxes, sales taxes, fees. It can also indirectly include lost customers. That's a little bit more difficult to calculate, but we'll try to talk about that a little bit. And lost places to serve as destinations. The kinds of costs we're talking about when we talk about it from the local government standpoint are the cost of public safety, the cost of infrastructure, the cost of traffic management, parking, and impacts on other properties. What are the costs to another property, whether public or private, from a fence, from lighting choices, from et cetera. And again, to step back to externalities for a second, a couple of those that I mentioned accrue to the local property, to a private property owner. And that may be a property owner, it could be a school district, it could be the residents, it could be the local government. There's going to be a variety of potential entities that can incur those externalities. And they're each going to get hit with different issues. The impact on me as the property owner across the street is going to be very different from the impact on me as a resident of the jurisdiction. But here's the key point. Again, it doesn't really matter whether the externality is going to hit a private property owner or a local government or a different local government from the one that you're dealing with. Who are they going to go to? It's always, when the externality hits, who are they going to say, hey, fix this? It's going to, again, be that local government. So how do we figure out the community economic impact of a preservation decision? We can look at the revenues. We can look at the actual revenues realized, and we can look at the unrealized revenues. We can look at the cost. We can look at the cost to the public sector, and in most cases, those are actually going to turn out to be easier to calculate because you can get the information a little bit more easily, and I'll show you that in a second. But you can also look at costs to surrounding property owners or other private property owners. Okay, let's talk about how you can do some of these kinds of mathematical calculations. This is how you turn those sort of vague arguments that preservation improves property values, or you'll get more revenue from a building than from a parking lot. This is where you start to turn that into real concrete information. And I'm purposely keeping this as simple as possible, and that's for two reasons. Number one, the folks on the phone here are going to have a very, very broad range of comfort level with this kind of thing. So I'm purposely keeping it pretty simple because I don't want anybody to feel like, oh my gosh, that requires a PhD in econometrics to figure out. You can do this stuff with a different set of tools if you have a PhD in econometrics, but you don't need it. The second thing is I'm trying to give you the basic tools, some basic ways of thinking about these things so that you can then go and sort of extrapolate to other situations. So let's start by talking about, one other thing I should add on this is that whatever you're going to do with regard to calculating and doing that math and demonstrating hard costs is going to depend to a great extent on being able to get the data. And that's another part of the reason why I would encourage you to focus on the public sector side of these arguments, because the data is a lot easier to get than if you're dealing with the private sector side, where people may or may not want to tell you exactly what it costs to do that work or how much they're going to pay their employees. So let's take a look at a typical example. So let's start by talking about what's probably the easiest to calculate, which is property taxes. And I need to step out of the presentation here for a minute and pull up a website. So let's see if I do that. I need to see all this lovely stuff across the bottom. And let's go visit my friend Dusty. I don't know how many of the folks on the phone here are in Hamilton County, which is the county that surrounds Cincinnati. I'm using Hamilton County as an example here, but you can find the same information certainly for any county in Ohio. And as far as I can tell through my years of doing this kind of stuff with communities all over the place, is that I think you can find this in one form or another in most other states as well. In Ohio, the terminology is the auditor's office. In some places in Kentucky, it's the PBA, which I'm now pulling a blank on what exactly that means. In Indiana, it's the state treasurer. In some other states, it's a different piece of terminology. At any rate, in pretty much any state, you should be able to find your county keeper of property records. This is the agency that manages the property taxes. And to use this one as an example, most of them have some kind of search function. Hamilton County's is a little more sophisticated than some of the more rural counties in Ohio and that I've dealt with, but it'll give you a pretty basic picture of how to do this. So as you can see from this screen, and let me check with they can see this correct? Okay, good. You can see I've put in an address. In the top box where it says low range, I put in 500, and down where it says street name, I put in Reading. So step number one is to have the address of the property that you want to make the argument for. And then we hit go. And it should go. There we go. And then it grinds and pops and thinks about it for a good period of time. It always works faster when you do it when you're not online. Well, what it's going to come up with, and I think we'll have it in a second, is it didn't like what I did. Great. All right. Let's go back. sorry about this. Of course, I have to have a special little glitch on this because you can't just make it work easy. So let's go back to the beginning and let's put that address in again. I think I need to capitalize that. Okay, now hopefully it'll decide it still likes this, and it will grind and pop, and there we go. All right, something actually worked. It's a wonderful thing. For pretty much any property, you will be able to find a property card like this. And it looks like a great sea of data until you actually start digging into it and get a clue as to what you're looking at. I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of different pieces of information. Obviously, this will give you your land use data. It'll tell you how many square feet. If you're doing other kinds of calculations, that can be valuable. Tells you how much acreage. If you're interested, you know, if you're a historic preservation person, you know that these numbers for year built can be a little come see, come saw. Sometimes they're not right on the money, but yeah, there is at least a ballpark. They're usually within the neighborhood of right. But take a look down here. Here we have the tax data relating to the property. So here is the market land value. That's this number here that I just highlighted, $62,200. That's the value of the land. That's the assessed value of the land without buildings. Then we have the value of the buildings. And then we have the total. So obviously, the 62 plus the 147.8 equals the 210. Here's the part that gets interesting. Here are the taxes. And you can do this for any property, whether it's a new property, an old property, it's in an incorporated area, it's in an unincorporated area, wherever that may be. So again, here is the tax calculation. We have 6,200 or 62,000 land value, 147.8 building value. Here's the full tax rate right here. Here is the reduction factor, and in different states there will be different ways that legislatures over the years have monkeyed with the amount of the tax. So there may be some kind of a reduction factor, and you have to, in Ohio, that reduction factor is simply subtracted from the full tax millage, and you get this effective tax rate right here. And what you then can see is the amount of real estate, the amount of tax that the property is paying. By applying this effective tax rate to that land value, you can actually figure out how much of a property tax hit the community would take by permitting a demolition. And Dusty, my good friend the auditor here, actually made it pretty easy. He actually put in a way to calculate what it would be if you change that value. And so I can see here that the real estate tax actually dropped very substantially. So again, what you can calculate a lot of times depends on the data that's available to you. And I would argue that for most Ohio communities, that property tax data is one of the easiest things to get your hands on and easiest ways to work with it. So again, the assessed value times the millage minus any adjustments. And in Ohio, typically they do that millage minus adjustments for you. That's that effective tax rate. There's your property tax. And if you want to see what happens if the value of a building declines, you can do that. If you want to see what happens if a building is demolished, that's how to do that. So let's look at a different kind of tax. In Ohio, municipalities, cities, villages, income or earnings taxes are very critical parts of the local government's funding stream. So you can, it is relatively straightforward to estimate the number of employees. You can estimate the number based on who's working in that building today, but if there's need for a demolition, if the property owner is saying that they need to demolish the building or they want to do an inappropriate rehab to it, chances are the number of people actually working in that building today might be lower than it should be. But you can also, and I'm not going to get into where you find these, but simply all you have to do is really Google national and regional employment average per square feet for different types of property use. And that will give you a reasonably decent estimate of how many people could be working in that building. You can also do that simply based on some rule of thumbs, and generally it's good to talk to a developer or an architect to get a sense of these rules of thumb. So typically, office employees in a call center type environment will require a total of about 25 square feet per person, and that includes a portion of the break rooms and the restroom facilities and all of that kind of thing. So you can do that calculation, and if you go to the website of any local government, you can find the tax rate. And again, that's actually a fairly easy thing to find just by going into a search engine. So you say earnings income tax rate for Village of Evendale, and you will find it very quickly. Those are typically pretty easy pieces of information to get. The third bullet down here, in some communities there's a reciprocity. If I live in one jurisdiction and I work in a different one, there's some situations where I may not be paying the full amount of taxes that I would be if I lived and worked in the same place. You might be able to ignore that if you're simply trying to put together the numbers to make an argument for the potential, particularly if it's a big difference between, say, an existing building and a parking lot. So the number of employees times the income tax rate gives you the amount of income tax that the jurisdiction should be receiving. If you're looking at a situation where there's a building that could hold 100 employees, but they want to demolish it for a parking lot, then that's a very different, that's a pretty drastic difference to be able to demonstrate that you could, a local government, be bringing in this much money at a fairly high rate, and instead you will be bringing in a lower level. Sales tax is a similar kind of situation. You can estimate it based on typical local experience. Again, talking to your local retailers should give you a sense of that number, and or you can find national averages per square feet. I haven't found a national average that I'm totally happy with in a small city type environment, so I would actually recommend talking to your local retailers to get a handle on that. And retail, one very good source for that may actually be retail real estate brokers. Because the value of a retail property is pretty much directly derived from expected revenue, expected sales revenue. So the people who handle retail brokerage for your environment should have a fairly decent handle on that. And again, it's simply sales tax rate times sales tax. One thing to keep in mind in Ohio is that typically goes to the county government, not to the local government. And then there are a whole variety of other types of taxes. When we're estimating the externalities, when we're estimating the costs that a development or preservation decision can make on the local community, this is going to be a little less persuasive in those cases because we're talking about a fairly small portion of the existing jurisdiction. It's also a lot harder to estimate costs. So if you've only got the ability to do one side of the equation, I'd focus on the revenues. If you can show your local elected officials the potential to make more money, essentially, from an existing building versus a parking lot or a rehabbed building that has a high assessed value versus a sort of chopped up, poor quality building, that's going to carry a lot more weight. So as I pointed out here, in the case of a demolition, it's not going to be that important, but if you are in a situation where the proposal is to replace an existing historic building with something much larger, a much more intensive use, then some of these cost arguments are more likely to become important. So we have a variety of typical types of costs. You know, the kind of costs that your local elected officials will care about include public safety, health and welfare, street maintenance, administration, and building and development. So in some cases, it's fairly easy to calculate this. If you can get per unit costs for different kinds of uses, or for different kinds of services, let's say cost per police run or cost for maintenance of a mile of roadway, then you've got something you can work with pretty easily. There is a piece of information out there called the Census of Governments. And the Census of Governments will actually give you a summary of the main funding items that various different local governments have taken on. That includes, it's self-reported data, so you have to be a little bit careful with it. But it is a source of data. And if you can figure out that a town of 50,000 spends X amount on public service, and you have a town that's basically similar physically, meaning you're not comparing an inner city, an inner ring suburb to a farm field, a farm community. But if you can look at that census of government, then you can get a sense that typical expenditure per individual, per resident, is a certain amount, then you've got a piece of information that you can start to apply. So you can look at costs of traffic congestion, so things like having to put in a new street light if the volume of traffic on a particular road goes up, or having to widen a road if the volume of traffic goes up because you've greatly increased the amount of activity on a particular site. You can look at the number of police and fire runs per type of use. So obviously an office building with 10 people working in it will probably generate a lot fewer fire runs and police runs than an office building with 100 people in it. You can look at the cost of, one of the really interesting costs, especially if you're dealing with a residential issue, is the cost of students in schools. Again, your local government may not directly be responsible for that, but increasingly they're going to care about that. And so finally, you take whatever average unit cost, and again, a lot of times you're simply dealing with the best data you can get. Your average unit cost times the number of those units added as a result of the proposed capacity, of the proposed activity, that's going to be your estimated public cost. And you know, one thing that you may find it beneficial to do is to compare the increased revenue to those increased costs. Especially, and again, if this part particularly comes in if you're looking at a big increase in the intensity of the use of the land resulting from a choice to demolish or extensively rehab or extensively work over an existing building. A lot of times what we hear from local governments is any new jobs are good jobs, but you can actually do the math using these simple rules and at least get a rough indication as to whether or not the costs that accrue to the local government are actually going to be covered by those expenses or by those revenues. So you've done your math. Couple of key things. Obviously, you're going to want to share your findings. You want to make certain that you show your work. It's going to be one of the things that very frequently undermines economic analysis is when somebody says, well, this is going to result in $14,000 worth of new investment. well, how is it going to result in 14? It just is. It's very complicated. It's very complicated. As soon as somebody has to say something like that, the credibility is shot. So you want to make certain that even if it's rough numbers, even if it's based on some assumptions, that you show your work. You make clear to people how you came to your conclusions. You have to remember to present this information as an estimate. Again, one of the biggest challenges here is in getting reliable information to work from. We're all familiar with the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. And if the information you've got to work with is based on a lot of assumptions, based on a lot of guesstimates, based on a lot of sort of windage, you know, that's going to have an impact on how accurate the numbers are. But the fact of the matter is, when we're dealing with this kind of information, even the most sophisticated econometric models in the world are still based on assumptions. And that's why it never comes out exactly the way we said. So keep in mind that no matter what you're doing in an environment like this, you're dealing with an estimate. You're not dealing with a precise measure. And keep in mind that this is just one of the elements. Obviously, if we're talking about economic impact to community, we're not talking about necessarily environmental impact. We're not talking about impact on the physical, on the viewshed of the street. And there's ways that we can get into another time, if you like, to talk about how to estimate the impact of something like an appealing street front on pedestrian activity, or a public park on people's willingness to be in a location. There's ways to estimate that. That's more complex, and it's a lot more guesswork, and it's a lot more of this garbage in, garbage out kind of situation. So what I've tried to do today is focus on situations where you've got halfway decent data and can do the calculations in a fairly straightforward manner. But regardless of what kind of calculations you're doing, the numbers are just one piece of the equation. What's in the best interest of your community is always a complex mix of the economic and the environmental, and the social and the cultural. So this is one tool. It's not all of the tools. But hopefully this gives you a way to get beyond sort of general knee-jerk assumptions and be able to talk to your local officials, to your community members in a fairly concrete manner about the potential costs and benefits of preservation decisions, or decisions that may go against preservation ideas, in terms of the externalities and the opportunity cost to the whole community. Shall we take some questions now, Devin?
Sure, Della. First, we'd like to thank Della today for doing this webinar with us. It was a great webinar to have, and also Heritage Ohio would like to thank all of you for attending today. If you have any questions, please send them through the chat box to me, which is Devin, on your screens there. And we're just going to have a short little break here for a second while you send in your questions, and we'll start with those right away. As we said, Heritage Ohio would like to thank you today. And Heritage Ohio exists to help people save the places that matter, build community, and live better. If you enjoyed today's webinar, please think about becoming a member of Heritage Ohio, and you can find more information about that on our website, which is www.heritageohio.org. So we are getting a few questions now, so we'll start with the first one. Carl is asking, I would be interested in calculating economic impact of improvements in storefronts and downtown images. Any suggestions on how to do that?
Sure. One of the key challenges of calculating the economic impact of a physical improvement to a building is, it goes back to that data issue again. You know, there's not a, it's going to take a little bit of digging to find data that really indicates that. Now, one of the potential solutions, one of the potential ways to go at that, again, basically, you're going to have to start by putting together the set of data to work from. To do that, it may make sense to talk to property owners who have done upgrades to storefronts. It may make sense to talk to Main Street programs that have put effort into rehabilitation of storefronts. And that would probably, I'm talking a little bit off the top of my head right now, but that would probably be one of the best sources to work from. If it's not going to be, this is not always an easy cause and effect. If a property owner upgraded their storefront, theoretically they should see an increase in sales. The challenge is that a lot of times a property owner who upgrades their storefront is also going to, at the same time, improve their merchandising presentation. They may improve their promotions. Chances are they're not doing one thing in isolation and testing it like that perfect scientific model that we were all taught way back in the day. So one of the key challenges, everybody I'm sure likes my little screensaver thing that'll make you nauseous. One of the key challenges is going to be identifying properties that have improved storefronts and hopefully haven't done a whole lot of other things at the same time. Or if you can't do that, then just acknowledge that the storefront was done in conjunction with a lot of other things that were going on. But really the way to demonstrate that is going to be to find situations, really to find the data to be able to show that a storefront improvement led to an increase in sales. Now, one way that might be a little easier to get at that would be to look at the assessed value. And again, going back to my local government standpoint, because it's an easier data set, to look at the assessed value of a building before the storefront improvement and after the storefront improvement. Because if the storefront improvement was done well, it should increase the value of the property, either on a commercial assessment or on an assessment like the auditor. Auditors redo their assessments in Ohio every 3 years. In the other states, it's yearly or bi-yearly. So that might be, that's an indirect way to get at the question, but it's one using the data set that's easily available.
Thanks, Della. We have another question from Dave here. How do you deal with a community whose general attitude is to tear down rather than restore a building?
I would say I'm gonna go out on a limb here and assume that the community that has a general attitude like that is also having some problems supporting their tax base. So, I'm going to make an assumption here, just based on having worked with communities for a long time, that the community that has that kind of attitude probably isn't doing so well, just because that seems to be typically the trend that we're seeing in local governments in the Midwest these days. Based on that, I would actually argue for a large-scale version of this kind of study. If you can show and it may require drawing, let me back up for a minute. If you can demonstrate the impact to the city's bottom line, as in with regard to revenues, which of course is the piece of the puzzle that everybody wants to deal with and nobody knows how to deal with, then if you can demonstrate that the standing building has more potential for revenue to the local government than a parking lot or a vacant site, then that's that's going to be an important piece of starting to change that conversation. Now, if the existing building, if this is a urban neighborhood, one of the ones that has been experiencing, very high levels of disinvestment and demolition and vacancy and the like, then that may be a harder case to make. But there's still, I think, a very powerful case to be made in the value of a reasonably maintained and improved and occupied building versus a vacant lot. And demonstrating that is going to be, I think, the most effective tool in changing that conversation. That's not going to change the conversation immediately, because if properties are getting demolished, then there's a reason behind that. And there's probably an economic reason, and there's probably a social reason, maybe some variant of, don't tell people what to do with their property. One of the things that you can do by doing this kind of analysis that I've been talking about is you can change the conversation from what does this mean for the property owner to what does this mean for the community. And if you can demonstrate that difference in value between the vacant site and the restored building, or the reasonably renovated building, then that's going to have, I think that's going to make a very powerful case in many cases. It may not change it immediately, but it'll certainly start some thinking in a new direction.
And a question akin to this one from Dave. Joyce is asking, many problem properties are vacant and may not have new use readily at hand. The public perceives the cost to the community of a derelict building as being very high. How do we use monetary value to buy time?
Okay. One of the key challenges in that is precisely what you identified, is that it's, if there is a vacant building, I can come up with all sorts of scenarios where in some idealized world, maybe that building would be reused, would be revitalized, would have some kind of wonderful economic activity going on in it. But if it's a vacant, minimally used property in a sea of blocks and blocks of vacant, minimally used properties, then it's much harder to make a reasonable expectation about what that use could be in the future. So part of the challenge is to kind of keep the expectations modest. You don't want to go wildly off into the wild blue yonder with that proposed future use, even if having a web design studio in there would be just utterly cool, and that would be fantastic. So part of the issue is to really demonstrate, in the case of a vacant building, let me put it this way. If you have a vacant building, it is not generating revenue to the local government, or if it's generating revenue, it's generating very, very minimal revenue, especially if it's not being maintained very well, which means that its value is going into the tank. At the same time, if it's a vacant building, then the local government is probably having to step in and make some expenditures. So they may be having to mow, they may be having to maintain landscaping, they may be having to board up the property, there's going to be police calls relating to the property or police monitoring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can document those costs, that starts to make a case for a vacant building or a vacant lot. Frankly, a vacant lot can be as much of a problem almost as a vacant building. Then we can start to make a case for the fact that just letting this building be vacant or demolishing this building and having this vacant property that we still have to maintain and mow and police and et cetera, that becomes less viable. That becomes less of a good deal to the local government. we have a lot of situations particularly in the Midwest, where people are saying, "Oh, we can't fix this. Oh, this is not solvable. This is, we have all sorts of problems. We can't get people into these properties." And that's typically, there's a lot of evidence nationally to indicate that that's not entirely true. You can get people into those properties. They're especially in an environment that's increasingly entrepreneurial, where we have a growing young population who want, particularly an urban environment. We have more and more opportunity to turn those properties over. And if we can turn them over at a low cost to the property owner, they may still be a better deal. I think it's very likely that it will still be a better deal than maintaining the cost of maintaining and policing that property on the public books for the long term.
Okay, we have one final question, and it's pretty similar to what you've been talking about. Carrie is asking, how or when do you take into account the carrying costs of the building when it's underutilized?
Oh, very good question. The carrying costs, and I'm going to assume, do we know whether she means the financial carrying costs, meaning the cost of the mortgage or the loan on the property, or are we simply talking about carrying costs in terms of the maintenance?
She's talking about the financial aspects, the insurance, the taxes, things like that.
Okay, good. I would say those need to be upfront right from the beginning. If the local government, particularly if we're talking about local government, if their insurance is set up such that they have to maintain, specified insurance for vacant properties, and in some places they have to do that, in some places that's just included in their sort of overall insurance. Those kind of costs are definitely part of the equation. Now, typically, if you're dealing with a local government scenario, they're not going to be responsible for loans on the property. Obviously, the carrying costs that a private property owner has on a property can be a very significant piece of whether or not they can preserve the building and make it make economic sense from their personal perspective. So if there's a question of, one of the things that we didn't have time to get into today is changing the equation for the individual property owner by what preservationists often know as gap financing. So if preserving a building would require, or doing appropriate rehabilitation to a building would require more than the building can generate in income, then there's a gap. And at that point, it becomes very appropriate, I would argue, for local governments to, if not work on filling the gap, to help find resources to fill the gap. Many local governments can't simply do that themselves, but there are resources that are available to them that the local property owner, chances are, may not know about.
Okay, now for our final question, that was our final question, but I think this one is pretty good. From Anthony, what are your thoughts about abating or developing a CRA to forgo taxes to encourage/incentivize development in a neglected block of a historic neighborhood? Do you think this will truly incentivize that development?
There's really two different things here. CRAs are a specific funding mechanism that particularly urban governments have used. I'm not going to claim to be the world's primo expert on CRAs. They haven't tended historically to work all that well. One of the primary challenges is that if you're in an environment where you want some kind of investment to be occurring that isn't already occurring, chances are that the ability to generate, chances are the key problem is getting a use that generates enough income to maintain the property and the property's use. Because the CRA abates taxes, it helps on the back end. It affects the tax load of the property at the end of the year. In some cases that can be beneficial, but I think those tend to be beneficial mostly in places that already kind of have something going for them. So CRAs have been a lot of times applied to places where the potential uses and the potential owners, the potential, occupier or business uses are so shoestring that the CRA approach, it's offering them something that is fine but is not going to help them get off the ground from day one. That's a typical challenge with tax abatements is that it's an indirect benefit, and it's a benefit that assumes that you've got enough wherewithal within the business operation to be able to make a go of it, and that you can float the costs until you get that, lower tax bill, and then, everything will be just hunky-dory. My argument would be, if you can do a tax abatement, that's definitely better than nothing. And there are tax abatements that are more effective and have less strings attached than CRAs. Not every city can do that. The city of Cincinnati, for example, which is a fairly large city, offers a 15-year tax abatement, property tax abatement. And that's been pretty effective in facilitating market rate housing development. But again, you're dealing with developers who, aren't working from the bare shoestring right from the moment. I would posit that a community that has to rely on a CRA approach for doing tax abatements might actually find it more beneficial to put money into some upfront activities, into small business generation, into first-time homeowner type facilitation. I don't think that the tax abatement itself is really going to move the needle in a lot of cases. But I think you can take even a very small amount of funding to help facilitate entrepreneurship and home ownership, and that can make potentially a bigger difference in a distressed area than strictly CRAs. And frankly, one of the really good emerging examples right now that's definitely worth looking at is the city of Detroit, because they are doing a version of what Baltimore did 30 and 40 years ago, where they are really subsidizing a lot of the upfront costs simply by being willing to give away properties or make properties available at a very low cost to people who, have the desire to make something happen, have the skills to make something happen, but don't really have the upfront funding to make something happen.
Okay, Della, do you have any final remarks for anyone? Any tips or any suggestions for them?
Don't let the math scare you. Do the best you can with it. A reasonable calculation where you show your work is better than nothing. And a reasonable calculation, and especially if you can approach it from a point of view of this is something that we need to consider as opposed to this is the absolute gospel truth, then that's going to be a much more effective tool, I think, in changing those conversations, whether it's with regard to a community-wide approach or with regard to a specific development situation. I've put up on the screen here a few other sources. These are, again, focused on that fiscal impact element. That's the local government side of the equation. So there's a few things here that I know that the first two are available online. You can put those into a search engine and you will find them. The third one is, if somebody's really dying to read one of these two studies, let me know and I can find them for you. I'm not sure that they are online themselves. So again, it's a complex topic. It's a topic that people write PhDs on, but it's also a topic that if you make some work in this direction, it makes a big difference. So if people have questions, this is something that's relatively easy to work through based on the data that's available. My contact information is on here. Just a note on Facebook. I know a lot of Main Street folks use Facebook. I have two Facebook pages. One is personal, where I whine about and things like that. If you don't want to deal with that stuff, go for this one that has AICP, CECD after it. It's a way to make them different. And that one is more professional stuff. So, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm grateful for all of you taking the time to be on the phone and to be listening to all of this today. I thank you very much. We can do really good work with the information that's available if we're honest about the shortcomings of the information we've got to work with, and we do the best we can with it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Della. And Heritage Ohio would like to thank all of you for coming today. Our next webinar is going to be on September 7th at 1 o'clock again, so we'll see you then. Thank you.